Welcome to the Alpha Pickleball Podcast, where we slice through the noise to bring you the juiciest insights, strategies, and stories from the dynamic world of pickleball. Join us as we serve up engaging conversations with top players, coaches, and enthusiasts, giving you an ace perspective on all things pickleball. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just stepping onto the court, get ready for a volley of knowledge that'll elevate your game to alpha levels. Let the rallies begin.
All right, welcome again to the show. I'm your host, Tats. We have the one and only Steve Deakin, pickleball pro, do they call you Captain Canada? I don't know.
I've heard a lot of different things. Yeah, Captain Canada is one of them. The Beaver is another. I've been there's quite a few little nicknames kind of swarming around, and I've been called a lot worse by a lot of people. So those ones will work just fine.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I started tennis late. And I kind of vaguely remember your name. I think we're about 3 years apart. So when I was going into 16s, I think you were out of 18s, right? So I didn't really, never met you, but I remember your name mentioned here or there. But talk to me about just how your sort of early sort of tennis athletic journey there, and then we can tie that into how the pickleball came into it.
Yeah, sounds amazing. No, I was a very high level baseball, soccer, and tennis player from very early age, 5 years old. And eventually there came a time at 12 years old where my parents were like, listen, this is a lot, for us to keep up with, and we gotta pick a sport here to focus on. And it was kind of strange because I felt I was a better baseball player than I was a tennis player. But for some reason, I decided to play tennis. And my dad kind of got me into this club in Coquitlam area at the time. It was Blue Mountain Racket Club. It's no longer in existence, but it's where I kind of got hooked in with a lot of the top players in the province. And what ended up happening is I was, going to train after schools. I was probably playing no more than 8 hours a week, and they ended up having a national championship at the home club in Coquitlam. So I entered it, and I ended up winning the national championship. At that time, I'm playing 8 hours a week, and I was beating all these players from Eastern Canada who had a lock on the national tennis scene, at least in the under 14s. And at that point, Tennis Canada said, "Who is this guy?" And I was joined with that high performance Tennis Canada team at that point, and that really opened up a lot of doors for me to pursue tennis as a career.
Wow. And I know that, part of your tennis thing was sort of cut short by injuries. Was that sort of overplaying, or how did that sort of happen to you?
Right. And it's one of these things where tennis has provided me so many incredible opportunities at such a young age. Like I had the opportunity of playing like World Youth Cup, Sunshine Cup, traveled a ton through Europe and South America. It was an incredible experience. I was able to compete for Canada in the Pan American Games, which was such a huge honor. And then I started playing around that 16, 17-year-old age range, started competing on the satellite tours in the US. Event, got some ATP points, and then I got sidelined with this brutal elbow injury, and I do feel it probably did come from overtraining, overplaying, overcompeting. But I was so young, right? And you don't think that, anything catastrophic like that would happen, especially when I'm just on the tip of breaking in. Like I beat a guy at Pan American Games that was top 200 in the world. So I was starting to see a vision of professional tennis, and felt it was like a stone's throw away. So it was super depressing, to be honest with you, when that elbow did give away, and I had to make some pretty severe career choices.
Yeah. And what did you end up doing from there?
So it turned out it was a Tommy John's injury, which was it's more common in baseball pitchers. So it was a lot of ligament damage and tendon damage, and there was a surgery to repair that, but at that point in time, the medical advancements weren't great on it. And they were saying you're looking at about a year and a half recovery on it. They were going to need to transplant a tendon or ligament from my wrist into the elbow. So it was fairly extensive. And in like a young mind, I thought that was an eternity, and my folks were super supportive. But at the end of the day, they left the decision to me. And I decided at that point to retire and go work my family's business at the time.
Yeah, for sure.
And really, like, Tats, looking back on that, it's I probably would have made a different choice, looking back and knowing what I know now about life. But again, I was young, and I just wanted to move on with life.
Yeah, for sure. And then pickleball came around, and you got another kick at the can.
You know what? It is actually completely unbelievable. And I left tennis for a good part of 20 years. I went and I worked for my family's business. Worked a 9-to-5 job. I played a lot of different sports during that time. Like, I kind of got immersed with slow pitch and men's fast pitch ball again. Played a lot of squash. Got into mountain biking, golf. So it was, I was always keeping myself active. And 20 years later, I found myself back on a tennis court again, and competing at that kind of 35 plus, 40 plus age bracket, which I instantly fell in love with the sport of tennis again. And really had a kind of a great master's career, if you want to call it.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I didn't know you went back into tennis
Yeah.
for the seniors. Okay.
Yeah,
So,
and that's how I kind of fell upon pickleball, right? And like, I was playing, over 35s and over 40s in tennis, and reconnecting with all the friends I had as a junior, and loving life and loving the competition end of it. And I had the opportunity to compete for Canada in like the senior world championships on 2 occasions, and captain those teams. And it was just like it was a real special time in my life. And it came down at the end of the day, like, I'm telling you, tennis was expensive, right? And it was a huge time commitment. And not a lot of companies are sponsoring senior tennis players, right? So what ended up happening is, I was playing tennis at a tournament in Ottawa, and I was playing the qualifier for the World Championships in Cape Town. And I ended up, qualifying for it, but I had an on-court accident playing in the doubles final. I literally fell on clay courts. They were dry. It was hot. I made a quick adjustment with the footwork, and my feet shot out from under me, and I landed on an outstretched arm, and I like destroyed my shoulder. So it was once again, here I am. I'm a middle-aged man. I'm not healing as fast as I would like, and the sport that I love to play was just taken away from me again. So my dad, at that point, I was feeling super depressed and not being active anymore and trying to rehab the shoulder all at the same time. My dad kept bugging me to come down to the local rec center and try this sport called pickleball, because it's easier on the shoulder. There's not a lot of overhead. He was selling me on this really hard, right? And I was like, I have never heard of this in my life. What the heck is that? It sounds ridiculous. This basically was my thought process on it. And I declined the invitation to go and play. But he kept on me like every single Sunday. He's like, hey, let's go. Hey, let's go. And finally, I broke down, and I went to my local rec center. I walked into this gymnasium with 8 courts on a hardwood gym floor. I didn't have a paddle. I got one of the wooden paddles from the front desk. And we're playing with this mushy, soft, I don't know if you remember those jugs balls from back in like 2015, 2016. I went into this gym. It was filled, like 8 full courts, 2 courts waiting. Everybody's laughing, having fun. I was like, holy cow, this is like the real deal. And I step out onto the court, and I'm telling you, Tats, it was the most fun I've had on a court of any kind in years. And I instantly, within that session, fell in love with the sport, and got kind of immersed in it fairly quickly. So it was that's kind of my journey to pickle. And if a lot of things had to happen in order for me to find it. And I'm a believer in everything happens for a reason, and it definitely happened for a reason that I found this great sport.
Yeah, I mean, when you started pickleball, there wasn't the wealth of online information or stuff that's available now. How did you get up on the learning curve?
So there's a funny story about that. While I was at that rec center, when I played for the first time, I just started warming up with my dad, and I was like, oh, this has got a lot of similarities to tennis with the footwork and some of the shot mechanics and technique and stuff. And I knew absolutely nothing about the sport, but I caught the attention of some of the local 5-0 players of the area, because I guess they could hear, like I was making fairly clean contact, even though I'm using a wooden paddle, and my hands have always been really good. So I caught the attention of these guys, and they actually invite me, and I had no idea who they were or what their skill level was at the time. They invite me to come down and play a game with them. And I had no idea, what I was doing still, but we played a game, and I was lighting them up. I was ripping everything from everywhere. I was driving from the baseline. I was driving from midcourt. I was poaching. I was crashing. I was ripping off the bounce at the non-volley zone. I had no idea what I was doing, and I was destroying these guys. Halfway through the game, they say, hey, Steve. And I go, yeah. They go, we don't do this here. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they said, well, there's this thing called a third shot drop, and there's this thing called dinking, right? He goes, you should really look into this, right? And I'm like, come on, like, what are we talking about here? What is a third shot drop and dinking? Are you for real? So being a student of the game, I did go home, and I did pull up YouTube at the time, and I searched doubles strategy 101. And there was a couple of things that did pop up at that time. There was, some legendary matches from back in 2014 and 15 of nationals and some of the bigger tournaments like that. But there was this fellow that was an instructor at Backer, Bakker, and he had a double strategy 101 clinic kind of on his YouTube page at the time, right? Or YouTube channel. So I click on this thing and I literally start going through all of his thought process. It was super simple. And I learned a lot from that. But from that day on, I did really start thinking about the game more carefully and how I could, become a better player. I had no idea, what pickleball had in store. I didn't know that there were tons of tournaments in the States. I didn't know that, players were starting to make a career out of this, through teaching and playing, right? Because a lot's changed since then. But I just started playing a lot of local events and, and started having some early success. And I went to nationals in 2017 with a buddy of mine in the 4-5 division. And that's kind of how the monster was created. Like I was just instantly obsessed, with the sport, and it turned out to be quite the journey for sure.
Yeah, I mean, you had your initial high performance tennis, you had your coming back to the masters in tennis and all these other sports. I mean, what sort of, like you said, we always wish that we could go back in time to do things over. I mean, what sort of
Yeah.
things did you do differently this time around because you had this base of information?
Right. To be honest with you, I had no idea there was professional pickleball. I don't even think it was called professional pickleball back in 2016. I think it was 5-0 and open divisions and that type of thing. And of course, I wanted to quench my competitive thirst, right? So I just started playing pretty much every day, as much as I could after work. And the thing that I learned to answer that question is it's so hard with pickle to not play 6 or 7 hours at a time. It's so hard because it's so fun. But what I learned, and of course I had to listen to my body, was only play 2 to 3 hours a day, right? And try to recover better and work out a little bit more specifically for the sport. And that I think has the best chance to lengthen a career. And there's no secret. Like I've had health issues in pickle later on in my career, which nearly destroyed it.
Yeah, for sure. How's from your point of view, I've asked other pros, how's the sport evolving and how does it need to be taught currently?
Right. I started full-time pickle at the end of 2019. I left my family's business and put all my eggs in the pickleball basket just prior to COVID, December of 2019. And I started up a pickleball academy. I started teaching a lot, obviously full-time playing, and you learn a lot along the way with regards to, developing players of all skill levels. And, like I've got a fairly simplistic philosophy, at those early skill levels, but I also have, the tactical and strategical knowledge, to work with pro level players as well. So, I'm a percentage based thought process coach. I'm a stickler for, not only learning like the proper technique and mechanics and skill development, but also marrying that with, the importance of shot selection and court positioning and scoreboard management and, things like that. And being able to marry those two things together, and also be able to really help out whatever student is in front of you, because everybody learns differently, right? So that's kind of my overall general thought process on how I think, the game should be taught. And I like to think that I have, the experience to be able to communicate that well with all my students.
Yeah, I mean, do you have any examples of, what your, examples of how you applied that philosophy to some of your students? Like, let's say they're more competitive, trying to become more advanced level players. Like, what are some things that you talk to people about?
Yeah, so again, like I've got this kind of baseline to kitchen thought process. Without getting into great detail, like I harp on making like good third ball decisions, understanding, do I hit a drop? Do I drive? Where do I drop or drive to? How do I transition to the non-volley zone after that? What do I do if I get jammed up in the transition zone? When I do get to the kitchen, how do I construct this point so I can extract that attackable ball? Where do I attack to? Like it's a bit of a layered thought process when I start working with people. And when I first started playing professionally back in late 2018, early 2019, and I had early success, I was doing quite well. I would like to think I was in that top 10 thought process at that time. And I wanted to break into that top 5. And it was frustrating. I was hitting podiums a lot, but I was never the top of the podium. And so I was, kind of held back a little bit. So I had to think to myself, what do I need to do in order to break into that top 5? And so I really looked at all the top players at that time, and I looked at where my holes and gaps were in my game. I was great at getting from the baseline to the kitchen, but I was not good through that transition zone. So and a lot of students that I work with, regardless of skill level, get jammed up in that transition zone, right? Like they might make a poor transition decision after a third ball. Guess what? They get caught mid-court. They may get blown off the kitchen line as they're being attacked. Guess what? They're jammed up in the transition zone. How do you defend from there effectively to allow yourself to kind of get reestablished back at the non-volley zone, where you're back at a neutral point phase? So this was the part of my game that was missing, right? And I worked feverishly on that, for probably 2 months, in that mid-court zone, how to block, drop, reset, even attack from mid-court in some instances. Started to get a better understanding of what that looked like. So usually when I'm working with the student, regardless of skill level, I can pick out pretty quickly where the hole is and make some changes around that. And every player's got the ability to do better, and I've talked to a lot of students that are like, I'm stuck at 3.5 and I can't get away from this, and I don't think I'll ever become a 4.0. And listen, like everybody's got different physical abilities and different technical abilities. But at the end of the day, I do believe that, those players can still excel and still can sneak into that next skill level if they put some time in and really think about it.
Yeah. So just instead of just, what you're currently able to do, just, I guess you just break it down into percentages and trying to improve your percentages in different aspects.
Well, correct. Yeah. And it's, like I do a ton of match analysis. It's probably like one of my most popular products that my students want. And, I do a live match analysis where I go out in the court with them, and we really break down the entire point, and go over these situational points that so many people make poor decisions on shot selection. And for me, this is where you can start closing the gap on the next skill level, right? And if you're playing that high percentage thought process, and in some cases it's not rocket science, you point it out and they're like, wow, I've never thought of that, right? And it could be something that is so simple, so it's for me. I get the greatest joy from those sessions because I can literally be a sponge for what I see on the court, and we can break it down and have intelligent conversations and have fun doing it.
Yeah, for sure. I also no, I think I saw somewhere that you're trying to develop a certification as well.
Yes, that's definitely in the infancy stage right now. It is a great deal of work, and it's something that I've been very passionate about, for the last 5 years, and it's something that I'm making a commitment to doing in the upcoming months. I hired a director for Steve Deakin Pickleball, which I'm thrilled to have done finally. It's been something that has been on my mind for years, and like I can't do everything, right? So it's I've made this investment in pickleball because I feel that it's growing, and I feel that the sport can do better in a lot of different areas. And I'm fortunate enough to have hired this director who has decades of experience in coach development and on the tennis side of things. But with my pickleball expertise and his programming ideas, I think we're going to be a great team.
Yeah, for sure. Talk to me about pickleball in Canada. I know, a lot of the hubs are US based. I remember when I first started tennis, Canada was only known for doubles. And I don't know exactly who was involved in it, but I remember hearing Louis Caillé, who was, I guess, the Davis Cup captain at the time, traveling the world and having a vision to develop, strong singles players. And I'm thinking, pickleball, is that, say, there's so many great US players. I mean, you're a great representative of Canada in the pro ranks, but for the future, what do you see happening, or what do you see that needs to happen to take that to the next level?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I've got a very good path for that, mapped out. It's no secret, what Tennis Canada program was through the years I went through it, as a junior. It's that grassroots junior development programming, and high performance programming, because I get contacted multiple times a day through my social media feeds, from parents, looking for, a high performance coach for their son or daughter. And, I just, I don't have the time right now to be able to do this. And that was a massive reason why I hired this director. It's going to take that load off, but the junior development is huge, and the high performance development, because there are a lot of great players in Canada now, right? And they a lot of them do need some form of high performance to figure out, how do I get to that next level, right? Like, how do I graduate, if you want, to play professional pickleball outside of Canada? Because right now it's different. You know, the PPA events that I'm playing, filled with qualifier draws and incredible young athletes. And this is the exciting part about the sport. And, you know, I'm grateful, you know, to be a part of it, you know, although tail end of my playing career. But I think, you know, my coaching and teaching end of things is going to explode once my playing career comes to an end. So like I'm super excited to be a part of it. You know, I love the growth of the sport in Canada because it is growing. You know, I think the Pickleball Canada membership is nearly doubled in 2-3 years, right? So it's good things are happening in the sport. There's obviously going to be growing pains in the sport as well. But at the end of the day, it's an exciting time to be involved, and I'm grateful for that.
Great, thank you. Hey Steve, is there anything I know I haven't asked you, but you want to share?
No, I'm just I'm getting ready to head down to San Clemente in a week. I'm super excited for this event. I've got a new partner with Johnson Cola in the men's pro division, and I'm teaming up again with a fellow team head gal named Liz Trulick. And then I'm also in that event playing in 2 of the senior pro events, and you know I'm fortunate to be teaming up with Julie Johnson again, and this fellow named Brian Shapiro out of the California area there. So I'm really excited to compete on the senior pro tour, you know, the odd time as well. So I'm kind of in a very unique spot, and I'm grateful for that.
Awesome.
Thanks for tuning in to the Alpha Pickleball Podcast with Tats. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe, rate, and connect with us on social media. Stay alpha on the pickleball court. Until our next session.